Okay, dear friends, we are moving on to chapter 6, talking about memory. And let's go ahead and dive into it, shall we? Hooray! All right, we're talking about how memory systems work in the human brain. This ends up being super important in order to understand how humans view the world, how we see things, how we understand things, how we remember things, because that then is going to impact how we behave, right? If I remember our conversation differently than you do, and this happens all of the time, then I am likely to behave differently than you will in regards to whatever it is that I'm remembering in terms of how we're supposed to interact with each other. In order to talk about the real basics, we've got to understand that memory is actually a collection of systems where first we have to um, turn information that we would like to remember into something useful that can be that the brain can use, right? In a similar fashion to we talked about this a little bit when we talked about our sensory systems, right? We have to convert the energy in the world around us, have to transduce it into something that our brain can understand. So that's the encoding process, right? You have to turn experiences and events into something that the brain can process. Once that's done, then you need to be able to store that processed information somewhere in your brain. And then the sort of, you can do all of that, but if you can't retrieve that information, then it does you no good. You've lost access to it. So you have to have all three of these systems working properly in order for memory to work the way it's supposed to in humans. So encoding, as I said, that's that transduction process where we translate the information that is coming in from the world around us, whether that is somebody speaking or the feeling of the wind on our skin or the sight of someone moving and doing something. That all has to be encoded into something our brain can understand. We then have to store that information in a very similar way to how a computer does. It's not exactly the same, and we'll talk about that in detail. Um, but it's a useful analogy that I'll come back to again. And then we have to be able to bring it back when we want it, right? So this picture means a lot to me. I was a spelling bee kid. I don't know, any of you guys, were you spelling bee kids? It's the worst kind of stress that you can ever imagine for somebody who's in like the third grade. Yeah, you need to learn all of these words and remember how to spell them and then say it in front of everybody. Um, actually won the spelling bee in my school one of the years. It was a big deal. I grew up in Texas, and for some reason, the spelling bee was a huge deal. Um, and I like won at my school level, and then I went to the regional level, and I was really hopeful that I'd then go to the national spelling bee and be a big deal. I was not. I got eliminated in the regional competition there in Tarrant County, Texas, and I still remember the word that stumped me. Right, I was standing up here like this kid, not smiling nearly as much as he is, and they asked me to spell the word leopardess. And I was like, leopardess. And in my head, I was like, I know I've seen this word. I know how to spell this word. I worked on this. Oh, crap. Why can't I remember it? And I was like, Leopq? I don't remember. I don't think I actually said a Q, but I got it wrong. And to this day, I still remember because I was so upset that I got eliminated. I still know how to spell leopardess to this day. Leopardes. Leopardess. At any rate, that was a failure of retrieval because I had studied that word. I knew it, but I couldn't bring it back to mind. The stress levels were too high. And again, when we talk about retrieval, probably in our next lecture, we'll talk about some of the processes that can interfere with getting to the information that you already have stored in your brain. Okay, so we'll talk about all three of these. We'll focus mostly this chapter on the not the encoding, the storage and retrieval processes. We've already mostly talked about the encoding process when we talked about our sensory systems, right? Turning energy into something the brain can understand, whether that's light energy or sound energy or kinetic energy. We've already covered that, so we won't belabor that process. Okay. Instead, let's talk about the different kinds of memory that we as humans possess. This is something that you're going to want to remember. This basic model of memory called the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. This was first proposed back in the late 50s, early 60s, if I remember right, by two researchers unsurprisingly named Atkinson and Shiffrin. And this model has survived because it does appear to conform pretty well to how we actually experience the world and how we remember things, how we store them. So what the Atkinson-Shiffrin model tells us is that we have different memory systems that we use in our brain. They are actually separate containers of memory, if you want to think about it that way, that we move through at different levels of processing. So you start here over on the left with sensory input. That's the energy that impacts us from the world around us, whether it's light or sound or whatever. We've talked about that, right? Now, the first place that goes is into a capacity that we call sensory memory. Your sensory memory is not a kind of memory that you're probably used to thinking about because we're not really consciously aware of it, because it lasts for only a very brief period of time. The capacity of our sensory memory is only about a second long, okay? And this is essentially the bucket into which all of our sensory information gets dumped when it comes into our body, right? As it gets reported to the brain. So this is everything that you are sensing. This is the feeling of your clothes on your skin. This is the sound of the air conditioner in your room. This is the buzz of the lights. This is the feeling in your stomach that you're maybe getting a little bit hungry. All of that sensory information is being reported to you constantly. Now, most of that information, like we've talked about before, you get rid of. You don't need it. It's unimportant. It's either a constant signal, like the feeling of your clothes on your skin, and so you learn to ignore it because it doesn't change. Or it's simply unimportant information that doesn't need to be attended to right now. And so all of that unimportant sensory information, if we don't attend to it, if we don't select it out of the sensory memory system for further processing, it gets dumped within about a second or so, and you don't even remember that that it was even ever there, right? Now, this capacity, however, it does last for about a second, and one of the primary purposes, it seems, of having this very vast storage of information, because there are honestly probably some estimations that I've seen of our sensory memory suggest that it processes terabytes worth of memory or of sensation uh, constantly, right? And so it's a ton of information. Most of it gets discarded. Now, why even have that capacity then? Well, it allows us, it lasts just long enough to allow us to string together sounds so that we can hear words instead of discrete syllables, right? You don't hear all of the different syllables and vowel sounds that I'm making. You just hear the words. And that is because the sounds last just long enough in sensory memory that they can be put together, right? Likewise, we see motion rather than a series of still images as somebody runs across our field of vision because of our sensory memory. We still have that echo of what was going on. Well, I say echo, a lasting image, whether that is auditory in nature or visual in nature or haptic in nature. It lasts just long enough for us to be able to string it together with what came just before and create a sensation of continuity in the world around ourselves so that we can see movement and hear words and understand things in a sequential manner. That seems to be the primary purpose of sensory memory. It also serves as the bucket from which we then pluck out bits of information that are important, kind of like bobbing for apples, right? I want that one, and so I go and get it, except you're not doing it with your teeth. Because, okay, that analogy is breaking down a little bit. Okay, you are selecting information out of sensory memory because you consider it to be important. You hear the door bang over on the other side of the room, and you look over at it because you want to know what's going on, who just walked in the door. You have selected that information for further processing and focused in on that spot and on that sound so that you can understand it better. When we select something out of sensory memory, it then moves into a different memory capacity that we call short-term memory. And you've probably heard of short-term memory. It is also frequently called working memory because that's where we do our mental work, is in working memory or short-term memory. Short-term memory is much smaller in capacity than our sensory memory. We can really only hold about, as adults, about 7 pieces of information at any given time in our short-term memory. 7 plus or minus 2, depending on the individual and their capacity. Um, Short-term memory lasts longer than sensory memory despite having a smaller capacity. Things will stay in your short-term memory for about 30 seconds or so. And after 30 seconds, if you're not processing the information any further, then it gets dumped out of the system again, right? Think about, okay, so I mentioned earlier, one of the sensations that I'm feeling is mild hunger. So maybe for a second I pay attention to that and go, oh, I'm starting to get a little hungry. What am I going to have for lunch? I'll make myself a sandwich. Sure, fine. And then I don't think about it anymore. That information, unless it is important enough or I'm excited enough about the sandwich that I'm going to make, that I'm going to think about it more and again. If it's just a passing thought and it's not worth storing, then I'll forget that I've had it within 30 seconds or so once I stop thinking about it. But you can keep things in short-term memory by continuing to process them, by continuing to think about them. If I then think, okay, what kind of sandwich am I going to make? I've got some ham in the fridge. We've got some fresh tomatoes out on the vine. I'm going to go pick one of those, and oh, now I'm getting excited, and now I'm spinning, continuing to spin my thoughts on this sandwich. Yeah, I'm getting hungry. Can you tell? Anyways, that then will keep that in short-term memory because I'm continuing to work on it, continuing to think about it. This is the process that we call rehearsal. Rehearsal is repeating something. Well, I mean, that's one type of rehearsal, I guess I should say. You actually have 2 different kinds of rehearsal. You have maintenance rehearsal, which is just repeating something over and over again. And then you've got elaborative rehearsal, where you think about the thing in sort of different ways and try to make connections between what you're thinking about and other information, right? So if I think about the sandwich and remember the sandwich that I had last week that I liked so much and say, oh, maybe I'll make the same sandwich again, and maybe I'll talk to my wife about it. Maybe I'll make my wife a sandwich too because she would really like that. Now I am now connecting the idea of sandwich to other ideas, and that's elaborative rehearsal, right? I am expanding on the sandwich idea. I really should have picked a different example. Dang it. Anyways, so rehearsal keeps it in short-term memory. Rehearsal also aids with moving information into long-term memory. Long-term memory is our permanent storage for stuff that we want to remember. So this isn't necessarily as relevant an example, the one that I'm going to give you right now, as it used to be, because now we no longer have the kind of information I'm going to talk about, we no longer bother storing, most of us. When I was young, if somebody gave you their phone number and you didn't have something to write it down on, you literally just had to repeat the numbers to yourself until you got to a point where you could write that down. Now, nobody does that anymore because we've got these, right? My phone's getting old. I can't remember the last time I tried to recall someone's number because my phone's got it for me. It's got that handled, and so I don't bother with that anymore. But there was a particular stress, especially if it was the number of somebody that you liked, that you actually wanted to call. You had to just remember those numbers accurately until you got to a spot where you could write it down and store it for yourself. Now, how would you do that? By simply repeating the person's number to yourself over and over and over again. That kept it in short-term memory through the process of rehearsal until you could write it down. Ironically, it also then aids in engraving that into long-term memory, right? If you repeat something often enough times, then you'll remember it. Now, what I was always told growing up is that you need to repeat something 7 times. I found that to be inadequate. I would repeat something 7 times and then go looking for it an hour later in my brain and realize it wasn't there anymore. I don't know the exact number that you have to repeat something in order to remember it. I would imagine that the number of repetitions goes up as the complexity of the information increases, right? But again, I don't have a specific number for you because it's maintenance rehearsal, that just repeating of things, isn't actually the most effective way to move things into long-term memory. We'll talk about more effective ways here in just a minute. At any rate, then that whether you are intending to remember something and repeating it to yourself to try and move it into long-term memory, or making connections between that thing and other things that you already have stored in memory in order to aid in the storage of that memory. Again, elaborative rehearsal is a better method of moving things in a long-term memory than maintenance rehearsal. At any rate, those are our different memory systems, right? You've got tons of capacity and sensory memory, very short duration, only a second long. Much less capacity for short-term memory or working memory, slightly larger in terms of its duration, right? About 30 seconds. And then long-term memory appears to have no expiration date on it. You can probably still remember at least a few things from when you were very young. And it doesn't appear that we ever remove information from long-term memory. Given the correct cues, memory cues, you could recall pretty much anything that you had ever stored in long-term memory. And it's not that we ever lose information in our long-term memory. It's just that we lose access to it. We forget how to get back to that information. Now, you'll see with both sensory memory and short-term memory, the information that gets dumped instead of getting processed further. This slide calls that forgetting. I would not use the term forgetting here. Forgetting is a different process that we'll talk about when we talk about retrieval from long-term memory. That's when you fail to retrieve information that you've got stored. That's forgetting. This other process where I've got something in sensory memory and I don't pay any attention to it and so it gets dumped, or I've got something that I think about just really quickly in short-term memory and it doesn't matter at all and so I don't think of it again and so it gets dumped out of short-term memory, that's not exactly forgetting. That's more like information dump. You can't forget something that you haven't stored in long-term memory, so I would use a different term there. All right, now, speaking of I've mentioned some of these principles already, but talking about sensory memory, yeah, I sort of talked about it extensively. I'm not going to repeat everything I just said. This is everything that comes into the body. This is short in duration, large in capacity, and we select information out of sensory memory through the process of attention. If something that is being reported to my brain from my body matters, I'm going to pay attention to it, and that's what moves something from sensory memory into short-term memory. Now, our short-term memory, there have been extensive tests done on short-term memory to show its capacity and its length. And you can see here, if you've got something that you display to somebody without asking them to remember it, you can see how the percentage of recall declines over just, a dozen or a couple of dozen seconds to where you can only remember a very, very small amount of what you saw, even just 30 seconds later, because that stuff just gets dumped unless we think about it more. Now, one of the ways, I mentioned that we can really only hold about 7 items in short-term memory at a time. That is actually something that we can manipulate a little bit in a variety of ways. You can't really increase the number of items that you can hold in short-term memory through practice or anything like that, but you can increase the amount that you can hold in short-term memory by deciding what one bit of information is, right? So if I say FBI, IRS, CIA, APA, That's 12 letters. If I ask you to recall all 12 of those letters without any sort of association to it, then you're going to have a really hard time remembering that sequence of letters because it's 12 bits of information. That's too much to hold in short-term memory. However, if I then tell you, as you've probably guessed looking at the screen, that these are the letters of 4 different government agencies, then suddenly those 12 letters become 4 bits of information because they're 4 different names. You've got the FBI, you've got the EPA, no, IRS, sorry, FBI, IRS, CIA, and the EPA. You know what those 4 things are, and therefore suddenly now you're thinking of 4 names instead of 12 letters, even though it's the exact same information that you were thinking of a moment before and having trouble remembering. So this process is called chunking, where you can look at simple information, whether you're talking about letters or numbers, and turn it into a smaller bit of information, or I'm sorry, fewer bits of information by chunking them together. So I do this with my phone number. The last 4 digits of my phone number are 8999. When I tell somebody my phone number, I never say it that way. I say 8999 because that's 2 numbers to remember instead of 4 numbers to remember, right? That's chunking in action. Now, talking about short-term memory, I mentioned that sometimes we call it the working memory instead. The working memory model is actually an expansion of the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of short-term memory, where we can look at what's going on and look at the different processes that are involved in short-term memory and separate them out from each other. So here we have the separate pieces of our short-term memory. Let's talk about the middle squares or rectangles first. These are 3 separate capacities within our short-term memory that work in conjunction with each other but are at least somewhat separate from each other. We have the visual spatial sketchpad where we recall and work on visual information. Okay, so that is you looking at this image and trying to remember it. You are going to be using your visual spatial sketchpad to figure out the relationship, the physical relationship between these different circles and rectangles. That's not a circle, that's an oval. Anyway, so that's the visual aspect of short-term memory. You've got on the right-hand side there the phonological loop. That is dealing with auditory information. So as you're looking at this figure, you're also listening to me talk. And as you attend to my words and try to pay attention to them and make sense of them, you are using the phonological loop simultaneously to the visual spatial sketchpad, because you can look at what I'm showing you and at my face and also listen to my words at the same time. We also have what we call the episodic buffer, which is information that has been called up from long-term memory to be used in short-term memory, right? So as you are listening to what I'm talking about, you are probably thinking about what you have known about memory processes previously and comparing what I'm saying to what you already knew and seeing where it agrees and where it disagrees or where there are gaps in your previous knowledge, and you're making that comparison, right? That's the episodic buffer. Great. So you've got those 3 capacities working alongside each other. The central executive that you've got up top is the actual working process, right? Think of it as a little person sitting in your brain, sitting at a workbench and putting all of these pieces of information together. Now, to the best of our knowledge, you do not have a little person in your brain. It's just you, right? It is your active thinking is your central executive. It is you actively considering what I'm saying and looking at this image and putting it together in your brain in a way that you can recall and care about and think about, right? That's the central executive. That's the sort of organizer of all of this information. And then, of course, long-term memory is related to your working memory as well. It's not necessarily a part of it, but we use it in working memory because, as I said, we draw up information from long-term memory, and not just episodes that we recall from our life, but also images that we've seen before and things that we've heard before, and use that to compare to what we are currently experiencing so that we can understand what we are currently experiencing. We constantly make reference to what we already know, what we've already experienced when we experience something new, because we're constantly trying to categorize new experiences in order to understand them and know how to respond to them. And so everything new that you take in is viewed in comparison to what you've already experienced before. So that's how long-term memory interacts with working memory. Okay. All right, now long-term memory I haven't said a ton about yet, other than that it's just sort of where we keep things forever. There does not appear to be any capacity limit to our long-term memory. You can live for 120 plus years and still carry memories from your very earliest years. It's not like we learn too much and it crowds out previous information and that information gets dumped from long-term memory. That does not appear to happen. So there appears to be no functional limit to the amount of memory storage that we have in our brains. Or if there is some limit, we never really brush up against it in terms of the average person's lived experience. Now, where does this information get stored? That's a little bit more complicated, because it appears, based on the research that's been done, that we don't store information in our brain, in our long-term memory, the same way, say, your computer does. If you're working on a paper, you save your paper into a particular folder on your computer, and then when you want to use that file again, you just navigate to it, navigate through your nested folders until you find it, and then you click on it, and it opens up, and it's an exact copy of what you were working on before, because it was saved in that exact state. We don't store memories quite that same way. So imagine storing like a video file on your computer, right? You save it in a folder, and then when you want to see it again, you click on it, and it plays. If I want to remember something that happened to me, I can't just navigate to the correct folder and click on the video file and it plays exactly like it was when it was stored. Instead, and this appears to be both a side effect of how we store memory and also a benefit that allows us to store as much memory as we want. You store a lot of videos on your computer, you're going to run out of space, right? Because video files are large. However, when we store memories in our long-term memory, it appears that we break down that memory into its component parts, and different parts of that memory are stored in different spots across the cortex, the surface of our brain, right? So one spot on the surface of my brain will have the memory, let's say I'm remembering the last time my family got together, right? One part of my brain will store who was there. Another part of my brain will store what we ate. Another part of my brain will store the conversations that I had and who I was with. Another part of my brain will store how I felt. Another part of my brain will store what I was wearing and what everybody else was wearing and what the weather was like, and et cetera, right? So when we want to recall something from long-term memory, we have to put these memory pieces back together like a jigsaw puzzle. And that has some consequences in terms of the fidelity of our long-term memory, because frequently we introduce mistakes into our memory in the reconstruction process. But that does appear to aid with the apparently unlimited storage capacity that we have for long-term memory. Because we're breaking it down, you can pack them in pretty tightly and then recall that information at will. Okay. Now, our long-term memory, when you are trying to move things into long-term memory, you may have greater or less success depending on a variety of conditions. One of the things that matters is when you hear or when you see the thing that you're trying to remember later. So a lot of this research has been done on people memorizing and then recalling word lists. And in that particular kind of research, one of the most reliable effects that we see, it's actually a pair of effects. You have the primacy effect and the recency effect that both show up when trying to remember word lists, right? Trying to recall those things from memory. So if we were sitting together in class, I would actually have us do this. I would show you 20 words up on the screen, tell you can't write them down. I just want you to look through that list and try to remember as many as you can. And I'd give you maybe 2 minutes to look at the list. And then I would take the list of words off of the screen and then talk about something else for a couple of minutes. Why would I talk about something else for a couple of minutes? Well, to flush your short-term memory, essentially. So in order to keep things in short-term memory, remember, you've got to rehearse them, you've got to keep repeating them. And if I'm talking about something else, that's going to distract you, and you'll stop doing that, and the only words that you will remember at that point are the ones that you have successfully stored in long-term memory. Okay, cool. Then a few minutes later, I ask you to write down as many words as you can. When you do so, the first words on that list, most everybody is going to recall. The first word and then maybe the second or third word, everybody gets those pretty well. But then you get to the middle of the list and you start to get really fuzzy on what those words are, and you're going to have a harder time remembering them. You can see in the middle of the list, the recall dips to 40, maybe 35%. And then you get towards the end of the list, and the recall then improves remarkably again. So this improved recall for the first words and last words are what we call the primacy effect for the first words and the recency effect for the last words. Now, the primacy effect appears to be due to the fact that the words that you look at first on the list, you are going to have the most opportunity to repeat for yourself and find connections with for elaborative rehearsal so that you can remember them, right? You've got the most time to work on those. The last words on the list are easiest to remember because you just saw them at the end. There's nothing that came after them to sort of crowd them out. And so they're pretty clear, right? They're right there at the end of the list. There's nothing that is interfering that came afterwards, and so you remember those pretty clearly as well. The ones in the middle, though, the words in the middle of that list, you're going to have the most difficulty with because you didn't have as much time to rehearse them as you did the first words. And you saw words after them, you've got the last words, and so they're going to get crowded out in terms of your recall, and so you do tend to see these position effects, the primacy effect and the recency effect, showing up really reliably in memory. Okay, now we do have different kinds of long-term memory that have been studied. The basic difference between our long-term memories is whether they are declarative or non-declarative. And declarative memories are ones that you can declare, right? Things that you can talk about. This is the stuff that you know about yourself, where you grew up, how tall you are, the capitals of the states in the United States of America, if you know those and were forced to remember those at some point. Those are things that you can declare. Those are explicit memories. You can draw those up and you can talk about them really easily. Non-declarative memories, on the other hand, are ones that are not easy to declare. They are things that you know how to do, but that you may not necessarily be able to talk about really easily. Let's say you know how to play the piano. If someone says, "How do you know how to play the piano?" you're probably not going to have a great answer to that question. You're just like, well, I just do because I've done it a lot, and so I know how to play the piano because I can hit the right notes. I don't know, right? It's something that your body knows how to do, and so you can't really talk about those memories in the same kind of way that you can talk about what happened at your 16th birthday party, right? These are non-declarative memories. Now, on the declarative side, you've got semantic memories and episodic memories. Semantic memories are word memories and facts, for lack of a better term, right? This is, all of the capitals that you know. This is knowing the temperature at which water boils. These are word-based, right? They are facts. They are things that you know. Episodic memories, on the other hand, are things that you know that have happened, right? So the episodes of your life. You can remember that time when your dad lost his really ugly shirt that he loved so much when you guys were at the beach when you were a kid. I'm still convinced my mom threw it away. She denies it to this day. Regardless, that is an episode that occurred, right? I can call up that episode and I can remember what happened. I can remember me and my brother standing around and laughing about it, and Dad checking in all the trash cans there at the beach, and it was the best. Anyways, um, now interestingly, semantic memories and episodic memories, there's a third kind of declarative memory called autobiographical memories that corresponds really closely with what I was just talking about, even though I was talking about it as an episodic memory. Um, any memory that you are in that is a part of your own story is an autobiographical memory. Now, there is going to be part of that that is episodic in nature, and part of that that is semantic in nature in terms of the facts and the dates and who was there and et cetera, et cetera. So these two things sort of come together. Now, it's sort of difficult to think about an episodic memory that isn't autobiographical in nature, but could you tell me what happened in the last episode of Stranger Things, if you've watched that show, right? And you should, because it's awesome. I could tell you what happened in that episode, or at least some of those things. That is an episode that I recall, and it is literally an episode of TV, right? But I am not necessarily in it. Now, I can recall what happened in that TV show. I can also then recall the circumstances in which I watched it. I was sitting down with my kids and my wife, and we sat down and we watched it, and it was so much fun because that's a show that we all watched together. That aspect of it is an autobiographical memory. Me sitting and watching it with my family, that's autobiographical in nature. But me knowing what happened in the show, that's simply an episodic memory that is not necessarily autobiographical in nature, right? Because it doesn't have anything to do with me. It's just me remembering that TV show. Okay. Non-declarative memories, we do have different types there. The type I was talking about earlier, knowing how to play the piano, that's a procedural memory. That is a procedure. You know how to do that procedure. I have a daughter who is really, really good at knitting and crocheting. She knows how to do that in her hands, right? She can't necessarily talk really easily about it, although she could probably show me how to knit, and in fact has shown me how to knit, and I haven't spent enough time to really get it. But that's a procedural memory. It's something your body knows how to do, that you've learned how to do. There are other types of implicit non-declarative memories. Classical conditioning that we talked about in the last chapter is a particular type of non-declarative memory. It is an association between things that sort of exists in your body, and you know that this thing happening means that this thing happens as well. And then priming is another interesting one that we haven't talked about a whole lot. Priming is being in a particular situation that makes certain information more easily accessible, even though you may not be aware of it, right? So I had a mentor as an undergraduate, a psych professor, who ran a super interesting study where he showed that people whose polling places were in churches tended to vote slightly more conservatively on social issues, but not on like fiscal issues when they were voting in church, compared to people whose polling places were in other public locations like a school or a government building or something like that, right? So that is an example of priming. Being in that particular place in a church primes particular types of thinking and particular types of feeling that then can influence how a person behaves, even up to their voting behavior, right? And so that was super interesting study to me, and that's priming. We'll talk about that a little bit more another day. Okay, so I think this is just what I just said, right? So we've got our declarative memories, semantic, episodic, autobiographical. I've explained those, and then our non-declarative memories. So that's all I'm going to cover in this video today. We'll talk more about memory, and I will post that other video a little bit later in the week. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good one, and we will chat again soon. As always, if you've got questions or problems, please feel free to email me. We can set up an online chat or whatever you need. Okay, thanks.